They say a warning passed from father to child is worth more than a fortress of stone. Never trust the silence of the old roads after sunset. Welcome, my friend. I'm John, and I'm glad you've chosen to walk these forgotten paths with me tonight. The wind still remembers kingdoms that have fallen, and the hills keep secrets no map can fully reveal. Come closer to the fire, listen well, and let us follow the faint tracks that vanish into the wild. The last light of autumn lingered over the wild hills of Eriador, painting the weathered stones in shades of bronze before yielding to the slow approach of evening. A cold wind wandered through the heather and bent the tall grass in restless waves, carrying with it the scent of damp earth, pine resin, and distant rain. Few travelers chose these lonely roads once the sun began to sink, for the land between the scattered villages and the old North Road held more silence than comfort. Yet silence in the north was seldom empty. It concealed watchful eyes, hidden paths, and dangers that preferred twilight to daylight. Upon a ridge overlooking the road stood a lone ranger, wrapped in a weather-worn cloak the color of moss and shadow. His hood concealed most of his face, but the fading light caught the hard line of his jaw and the calm grey eyes that searched every fold of the countryside without haste. At his side rested a long sword whose plain scabbard revealed nothing of its true worth, while across his shoulder hung a bow of yew polished by years of faithful use. This was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, though few in those lands knew his true name. To the people of Bree and the scattered farms he was simply Strider, one of the mysterious rangers who appeared without warning and vanished before dawn. He had walked for many days without passing another ranger, though that troubled him little. Solitary roads had become his companions long ago, and the wilderness spoke with a language he understood better than crowded halls. A broken twig beneath an oak, the flight of startled crows, or the fading print of a boot in soft ground often revealed more than a dozen spoken reports. Such signs had led him northward during the past week, for several farms had reported missing livestock, abandoned wagons, and smoke rising from places where no hearth should have burned. None of those clues alone promised grave danger, but together they formed a pattern that Aragorn had learned never to ignore. He descended from the ridge with silent steps that scarcely disturbed the fallen leaves beneath his boots. The forest welcomed him with its familiar hush as ancient oaks stretched their twisted branches overhead, weaving a roof that swallowed much of the fading light. Moss covered broken stones that had once marked the edge of an old Númenórean road, though centuries of neglect had nearly reclaimed it for the wild. Aragorn paused beside one weathered marker and brushed away a layer of green moss with a gloved hand. Beneath it he found an old carving of the white tree, worn almost smooth by rain and time, and he allowed himself a brief nod before moving on. Not long after nightfall, he discovered the remains of a camp beside a narrow stream. The fire had burned low enough to leave only grey ash, yet the warmth had not entirely vanished from the blackened stones. Several sets of footprints surrounded the campsite, and Aragorn crouched to study them with practiced patience. At least 8 men had stood there, perhaps more, and among their tracks he noticed heavier prints, unlike those of ordinary travelers. The broad impressions, deep even in firm soil, reminded him of orc boots fashioned from rough leather and iron studs, though they had been partly concealed beneath fresh dirt, as if someone had wished to hide their passage. His expression hardened, but surprise did not touch him. Orcs had crossed the misty mountains before, slipping into Eriador whenever vigilance weakened, and they seldom traveled without some dark purpose. Stranger still were the footprints of men beside them, walking not as prisoners but as companions. Aragorn traced one print with his fingertips and found the edge clean and sharp, made by a well-crafted riding boot rather than the worn shoes of wandering beggars. Whoever had joined with the orcs possessed discipline enough to erase many signs, yet not enough to deceive a ranger trained from childhood in the hidden arts of tracking. The stream itself offered another clue. A patch of muddy bank bore the mark of something heavy dragged through shallow water before disappearing into the trees beyond. Aragorn followed the trail only a short distance until he found strands of coarse rope caught upon a thorn bush. Nearby lay a broken wooden chest, hastily smashed open and abandoned where its contents had been removed. There was no coin scattered upon the ground, no merchant's goods left behind, only fragments of wax-sealed parchment that the damp had not yet ruined completely. He gathered one torn piece and held it toward the moonlight, reading only a few faded letters before the remainder dissolved beneath his fingers. A distant sound drifted across the forest, so faint that another man might have mistaken it for the cry of an owl. Aragorn remained perfectly still, listening with every sense sharpened by long years beneath open skies. The call came again, shorter this time, followed by an answering note farther east. It was no bird. Orcs often mimicked creatures of the wild, believing themselves clever, yet they never mastered the natural rhythm of living things. Aragorn quietly extinguished the faint glow of his small lantern and slipped into deeper shadow, allowing the forest itself to conceal him. Minutes passed without movement. Then 3 figures emerged between the trees, carrying spears and moving with awkward caution. Their armor consisted of mismatched scraps of leather, reinforced by rusted iron plates, while crude helms hid their faces beneath jutting brows and yellow eyes that darted through the darkness. Orcs indeed, but not of the great armies that once marched from Mordor. These belonged to some wandering band, hardened by survival rather than discipline, and their whispers carried the harsh black speech mixed with broken Westron. Aragorn watched them from behind the trunk of an ancient oak until the last had passed within arm's reach, never suspecting they were themselves being hunted. He followed without haste, careful to match each step with the sighing wind that stirred the branches overhead. The orcs wound through the forest toward a narrow ravine where old pines crowded so closely together that even moonlight struggled to enter. There Aragorn climbed silently onto a rocky ledge and looked down upon a hidden camp concealed beneath the trees. Nearly 24 figures gathered around shielded fires whose smoke escaped through cracks in the canopy. Among the orcs stood several men cloaked in dark wool, armed with decent swords and crossbows, speaking together without fear. The sight troubled Aragorn more than the orcs themselves, for evil often grew strongest when men chose to serve it willingly. One man stood apart from the others near a fallen pillar carved with forgotten Númenórean designs. He wore a long black cloak, clasped with silver, and though his face remained hidden beneath a hood, his bearing revealed command. Aragorn watched as an orc approached the cloaked captain, carrying a bundle wrapped in thick cloth. The captain unrolled it slowly, exposing what appeared to be a flat stone, no larger than a shield, its surface etched with ancient runes that gleamed faintly beneath the firelight. Even at that distance, Aragorn felt unease settle upon him. The markings belonged to the old kingdom of Arnor, and such relics were not gathered by chance. He withdrew from the ledge before curiosity overcame wisdom. Numbers favored the enemy, and the darkness concealed dangers he had not yet measured. A lone ranger could strike swiftly, but he could not throw away his life upon reckless valor, for too much depended upon knowledge carried back to his people. As he moved through the sleeping forest, one question remained fixed in his thoughts. Why would orcs and men risk so much to recover an ancient stone buried in forgotten ruins, unless it possessed a value far greater than gold? Behind him, hidden beneath the whispering pines, the fires of the enemy continued to burn, while above them, the cold stars looked down upon a land where old shadows had begun to stir once more. Aragorn did not look back as he left the ravine behind, though every instinct urged him to keep the hidden camp within sight. Knowledge already gained was worth far more than one reckless glance that might reveal his presence. He moved through the forest with the patience taught to every ranger from childhood, placing each step where roots would muffle sound and where damp leaves would betray no trace. The night grew colder as thin clouds drifted before the stars, and the darkness settled heavily beneath the ancient trees. Somewhere beyond the hills, a wolf gave a low, uncertain howl, but the sound carried none of the hunger that belonged to wild beasts alone. He halted beside the crumbling remains of an old watchtower that had once guarded the eastern marches of Arna. Little survived beyond part of its circular wall and a staircase leading nowhere. Yet rangers still used such forgotten places as silent meeting points. Aragorn searched among the stones until he found a narrow crack where small pebbles had been carefully arranged. 2 had been moved from their proper place. That simple sign told him another ranger had passed only days before, leaving word without ink or parchment. He added a 3rd stone in a different position, a warning understood only by the Dunedain of the north, then continued westward to seek the one who had left the earlier message. The forest opened into rough moorland before dawn, where low mist clung to hollows between the hills. Aragorn climbed a rocky slope and studied the land as daylight slowly spread across Eriador. In the distance, smoke rose from scattered farmsteads, while farther north stretched endless wilderness, broken only by ruined walls swallowed by grass. Peace still lingered across the countryside, and shepherds would soon lead their flocks into open pasture without knowing how near danger had crept. That ignorance was the rangers' greatest success. They guarded lives that would never know the names of those who stood watch through storm and darkness. By midday, he reached a spring hidden beneath a cluster of weathered beeches. Fresh horse tracks crossed the soft earth nearby, accompanied by the lighter footprints of a man traveling on foot. Aragorn crouched beside the water and smiled faintly for the first time in many days. The prints belonged to boots fashioned in the manner of the Dunedain, their soles cut with a pattern unknown beyond the hidden people of the north. He drank deeply from the spring, refilled his water skin, and followed the trail into the hills with renewed purpose. He found the ranger before the ranger found him, though only because both expected pursuit. A sharp whistle echoed from above, followed by the soft hiss of an arrow burying itself in the ground a pace before Aragorn's boots. He stopped immediately and rested one hand upon the hilt of his sword without drawing it. "The hawk flies beneath cloudy skies," he called in a calm voice. Silence answered for several heartbeats before another voice came from the rocks overhead. "Yet still it finds the wind," the unseen watcher replied, and only then did a cloaked figure descend from the hillside with bow lowered. The newcomer was Halbarad, broad-shouldered and weathered by years upon the frontier, his beard flecked with early strands of grey despite his strength. He clasped Aragorn's forearm without ceremony, and relief briefly softened the stern lines upon his face. "I feared I had lost your trail," Halbarad admitted, glancing toward the eastern horizon. "Strange things move through these lands, and none of them travel openly." Aragorn nodded, for he needed no reminder of what he had seen. Together they settled beneath an overhanging rock where neither passing eyes nor sudden rain could easily find them. Patiently, Aragorn described the hidden camp, the alliance between orcs and men, and the cloaked captain studying the ancient stone. Halbarad listened without interruption, his gaze fixed upon the ground as though arranging each detail into a larger picture. When Aragorn spoke of the Númenórean carvings upon the relic, the older ranger's expression darkened noticeably. He reached beneath his cloak and withdrew a folded piece of worn parchment protected inside oiled leather. Upon it appeared an old map copied generations earlier from records preserved in Rivendell, marking forgotten signal towers that had once linked the Kingdom of Arnor across hundreds of miles. "The stone may belong to this network," Halbarad said quietly, tracing one faded mark with his finger. "Long ago, these towers passed warnings across the north, by fire, mirrors, and carved markers known only to our fathers. Most have fallen into ruin, yet some secrets remained hidden even after the kingdom perished. If an enemy uncovered those roads, every refuge used by our people would become easier to find." Aragorn studied the map in thoughtful silence. The pieces now began to fit together. Though the full design remained concealed, neither ranger noticed the raven circling high overhead until its shadow crossed the parchment. Aragorn looked upward at once, watching the black bird settle upon a dead pine some distance away. Ravens were common enough in the wild, but this one did not behave like a creature seeking food. It remained perfectly still despite their presence, its dark eyes fixed upon them with unsettling patience. Halbarad quietly rolled up the map and returned it beneath his cloak. "Whether servant or merely curious," he murmured, "I have no wish to test it." They broke camp immediately and turned south along an overgrown path once paved by the men of Westernesse. Before long, Aragorn discovered another troubling sign. Fresh wagon tracks had crossed the old road during the previous night, their deep ruts revealing a burden of considerable weight. Several horses had drawn the wagon, accompanied by many booted feet walking alongside rather than riding. The trail led not toward Bree or any village, but into country abandoned centuries before. Whatever the enemy sought, they had already begun moving it. By late afternoon, the rangers reached a ridge overlooking a broad valley scattered with broken walls and roofless houses. Once a thriving settlement had stood there under the protection of Arnor's kings, but now only ivy and thorn ruled its streets. Aragorn raised a hand, motioning Halbarad to remain low, for movement caught his eye among the ruins. A group of weary travelers, perhaps a dozen in number, struggled along the ancient road with 2 wagons and several children walking beside them. They appeared to be simple folk seeking safer lands, unaware that the enemy's trail crossed directly ahead of them. Halbarad's jaw tightened as he measured the distance between the refugees and the hidden valley beyond. If the orcs return before those families pass through... He left the sentence unfinished because neither ranger wished to imagine the ending. Aragorn had already made his decision before the words were spoken. "We cannot warn them openly without revealing ourselves," he said, "but neither can we leave them to chance." He slipped his bow from his shoulder, checked the string with practiced fingers, and fixed his gaze upon the distant road where innocent lives unknowingly approached the path of gathering darkness. Aragorn and Halbarad descended from the ridge by separate paths, keeping the travelers within sight while remaining hidden among the rocks and scattered pines. The valley floor stretched wide before them, dotted with broken chimneys and roofless cottages that had not sheltered living souls for generations. Autumn grass swayed between cracked foundations where children had once played, and the silence carried the weight of forgotten years. A pair of crows lifted from a ruined well as the travelers approached, their harsh cries echoing from the fallen walls. Aragorn disliked the sound, for birds often sensed approaching danger before any man could see it. The little company moved slowly, burdened by heavy wagons and weary feet. There were farmers leading thin horses, women carrying bundles wrapped in worn blankets, and children too tired to complain after many days upon the road. An elderly man walked at their head with a stout ash staff, pausing often to study the uncertain path ahead. They looked neither wealthy nor important, merely people seeking a safer place before winter claimed the land. Yet such folk had always suffered first whenever darkness reached beyond the mountains. Aragorn observed them for several minutes before a small movement among the ruins caught his eye. Near the shattered remains of an old granary, someone had concealed a strip of dark cloth beneath loose stones. It fluttered only once before becoming still again. But that was enough. A marker. Someone had prepared this place in advance. Aragorn shifted his position until he could see farther into the broken village, and slowly more signs revealed themselves. Fresh footprints crossed patches of dust, untouched by rain, and several stones had been stacked where no weather could have arranged them. He gave the call of a wood pigeon, soft and unhurried, and moments later Halbarad answered from the far side of the valley. The signal carried no alarm to ordinary ears, but the rangers understood its meaning well. An ambush lay ahead. Halbarad disappeared behind a collapsed wall, while Aragorn climbed onto the remains of a stable whose roof had long since fallen away. From there he gained a clearer view of the ruined streets, though he still saw no enemy. Whoever waited possessed more discipline than common brigands. The travelers entered the village just as the sun slipped behind gathering clouds. Their wagons rattled over broken paving stones, and the sound echoed strangely between empty buildings. The children looked about with wide eyes, whispering questions that their parents ignored. The old guide raised one hand, signaling a halt beside the shell of what had once been a market square. His expression revealed uncertainty. Even without a ranger's training, he sensed that something about the place was deeply wrong. The attack came without warning. A crossbow bolt struck the lead horse, which screamed and collapsed into the road, dragging the wagon sideways with terrible force. Before the frightened travelers understood what had happened, rough voices erupted from every direction. Armed men burst from shattered houses and hidden cellars, brandishing axes, swords, and clubs. They wore no uniform, only patched cloaks and weathered armor, but their movements revealed planning rather than desperation. They spread quickly around the square, cutting off every obvious escape. One of the outlaws stepped forward with a crooked smile beneath an untrimmed beard. His mail shirt had seen better years, yet his sword remained well cared for, and his confidence suggested long experience. "Throw down your weapons," he called. "Leave the wagons, and perhaps you'll leave with your lives." Fear rippled through the families as several men reached instinctively for old hunting spears that would stand little chance against trained killers. Mothers gathered their children close while the wounded horse thrashed helplessly upon the stones. Aragorn drew an arrow and waited. He counted the attackers one by one as they emerged from hiding. 12, no, 14. 2 more remained concealed behind the remains of a smithy, hoping to strike anyone who fled. Halbarad had seen them as well. The rangers had no hope of shielding every traveler if battle spread through the ruins, and so Aragorn chose the one thing bandits seldom expected. He aimed not at the leader, but at the rope supporting part of a cracked stone balcony above the marketplace. The arrow flew with a sharp whisper. It severed the weathered rope cleanly, and the weakened balcony collapsed in a thunder of stone and timber. Dust exploded across the square as shattered masonry crashed directly between the outlaws and their prisoners. Several brigands were thrown to the ground, while others stumbled back in confusion, shouting curses they could scarcely hear through the deafening roar. Before the dust had settled, Halbarad's first arrow struck another outlaw squarely in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of pain. Aragorn leaped from the ruined stable and landed lightly upon the broken pavement below. His sword flashed free in one smooth motion, its worn scabbard giving no hint of the noble blade concealed within. "Take your families and run west," he shouted to the travelers as he charged through the swirling dust. The old guide hesitated only a heartbeat before bellowing the command to his people. Panic gave way to desperate purpose as fathers seized children, women pushed the wagons aside, and the frightened company rushed toward the opening Aragorn had created. The outlaw leader recovered quickly enough to understand what was happening. "After them!" he roared, pointing his sword toward the fleeing families. 3 men broke away at once, but Halbarad met them with deadly precision. His arrow struck 2 before they had taken 10 steps, and the third abandoned the pursuit as another shaft buried itself in the wall inches from his face. Aragorn intercepted the leader himself. Steel rang against steel as their blades met with a force that echoed through the empty square, and the outlaw's confident smile vanished the instant he felt the strength behind the ranger's stroke. The fight spread through the ruins in a storm of clashing iron and flying dust. Aragorn moved with practiced economy, never wasting strength upon wild swings, each motion flowing naturally into the next. One attacker rushed him with an axe, only to trip over fallen stones, allowing the ranger to disarm him with a sharp twist instead of taking his life. Another lunged from behind a broken doorway, but Aragorn sensed the movement at the last instant and turned aside, driving the man backward with a powerful, shieldless blow. Even in battle, his thoughts remained fixed upon the fleeing families. Every heartbeat won for them was worth more than any victory over the outlaws themselves. Then a harsh horn sounded from beyond the eastern edge of the village. Every outlaw froze for the briefest moment before grim satisfaction spread across several faces. Aragorn heard something else beneath the fading note of the horn. Heavy boots. Many of them. Not the hurried steps of frightened men, but the steady march of soldiers approaching through the ruins. He looked toward the eastern road and saw dark figures emerging between the broken houses, their iron helms catching the last pale light of evening. The orcs had arrived far sooner than he had feared. The first orcs emerged from the eastern street in disciplined ranks, their jagged spears held low as they advanced over broken stone without hesitation. There were far more of them than Aragorn had seen in the ravine 2 nights before, and several carried round shields painted with crude black symbols that had been hastily daubed over older markings. Behind them marched the men who had chosen darker masters, their mail better kept than that of the outlaws, and their weapons sharpened for war rather than robbery. They spread through the ruins with practiced precision, sealing every avenue of escape. The outlaw leader, who only moments before had sought to rob helpless travelers, lowered his sword and stepped aside with surprising obedience, revealing that he had never been more than another servant. Aragorn understood the truth at once. The ambush had never been intended merely to seize wagons or food. The travelers had been bait, and the ruined village a place chosen to draw anyone who guarded these roads into open battle. The cloaked captain had expected rangers to answer the cries of innocent folk, for that was exactly what rangers had always done. It was a cunning snare, one built not upon strength, but upon knowledge of an enemy's honor. Aragorn's jaw tightened as he measured the closing ring around him, and silently admitted that his foe possessed patience as well as cruelty. Halbarad reached his side in a swift rush, his bow already empty after loosing nearly a dozen arrows. "The families have crossed the western ridge," he said between measured breaths. "They have a chance if we hold here." Aragorn gave a single nod, never taking his eyes from the advancing line. "Then our task is plain." Neither man spoke further. They had stood together often enough that words had become unnecessary. The orcs came on with guttural cries that shattered the valley's lingering stillness. Aragorn met the first with a quick step forward, striking the spear aside before its point could reach him. His sword swept in a bright arc through the fading light, and the orc collapsed without another sound. A second rushed in from the left, shield raised high, but Halbarad drove a knife through the gap beneath its arm before it could strike. The rangers fought shoulder to shoulder, moving as though years of shared hardship had taught them each other's thoughts. Dust and broken stone filled the air as battle spread through the abandoned streets. The outlaws joined the attack with renewed courage now that numbers favored them, circling like wolves seeking an opening. Aragorn refused to be drawn into reckless pursuit. Instead, he slowly yielded ground toward the narrow lane leading west, forcing the enemy to crowd together where their advantage became less certain. More than once, he caught glimpses of frightened children disappearing over the distant rise, and each glimpse strengthened his resolve to hold the line a little longer. An orc captain forced his way through the press, towering above many of his followers. His armor consisted of overlapping iron plates, scarred by countless battles, and one side of his face bore an old burn that had twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer. He carried a broad cleaver instead of a proper sword, its edge nicked and stained from hard use. Without challenge or boast, he charged directly toward Aragorn, trusting brute strength to break whatever stood before him. The impact of their first clash sent a shock through Aragorn's arm, but he held firm, turning the heavy blow aside with careful timing rather than meeting it head-on. The orc captain fought like a smith's hammer, each strike descending with crushing force meant to batter through defense instead of slipping around it. Aragorn answered with speed, allowing the larger warrior's own weight to carry each missed blow past its mark. Stone chips burst from ruined walls whenever the cleaver struck empty air, and sparks flew whenever iron met steel. At last the orc overreached, driving his weapon deep into a cracked pillar. Before he could wrench it free, Aragorn stepped inside his guard and struck once across the exposed throat. The great orc staggered backward, dropped his cleaver, and fell heavily among the shattered stones. A roar of anger rose from the remaining orcs, but before they could avenge their fallen leader, another sound echoed across the battlefield. A hunting horn rang clear from the northern ridge, its note bright and unmistakable despite the chaos below. Several orcs turned uneasily toward the hills, while Halbarad allowed himself the smallest smile. Figures appeared along the ridge, cloaked in grey and green, bows already bent. A flight of arrows descended almost as one, striking the foremost attackers before they understood the danger. Rangers had answered the warning left beneath the old watchtower. The newcomers descended swiftly through the rocks, no more than 7 in number, yet every man moved with calm purpose. Their captain, an older ranger named Baranor, wasted no breath upon greetings. "Drive them east," he called. "Leave none between us and the road." His command spread through the defenders at once. The scattered struggle became an organized defense, each ranger covering another while forcing the enemy away from the western escape route. The orcs discovered that numbers alone meant little when discipline stood against confusion. The cloaked captain did not appear among the fighting, yet Aragorn sensed his unseen hand guiding events. Several groups of orcs suddenly disengaged instead of pressing their advantage, withdrawing toward the eastern road in orderly fashion. The men followed without argument, carrying their wounded and abandoning the dead where they had fallen. Such restraint puzzled Aragorn more than a desperate attack would have done. Enemies driven by greed or bloodlust seldom retreated so cleanly. These warriors had accomplished something despite losing the field, and that troubled him deeply. When the last of the enemy disappeared among the distant ruins, silence returned with startling swiftness. Broken wagons stood abandoned in the square, arrows protruded from shattered beams, and the cold evening wind carried the bitter scent of smoke and blood. Rangers moved quietly among the fallen, binding wounds where life remained, and offering swift mercy where it did not. Halbarad knelt beside one of the wounded outlaws, who stared upward with frightened eyes that had lost all defiance. The man clutched weakly at Halbarad's sleeve. We were promised gold," he whispered through bloodied lips. But they sought, not treasure, a stone, beneath the old fortress. Black Hollow. His voice faded before another word could be spoken. Aragorn knelt beside the dying man, studying his face for any sign of deception, but found only fear and regret. Black Hollow. The name stirred a memory from lessons long ago in Rivendell, where old maps and forgotten tales had been preserved while kingdoms crumbled beyond its borders. Somewhere east of these ruins lay an abandoned Númenórean fortress built over ancient foundations, a place few living men even remembered. If the enemy marched there now, the battle they had fought this day had merely delayed the true struggle. Aragorn rose slowly, cleaned his blade upon the grass, and looked toward the darkening eastern hills where the last light of sunset had already vanished. Whatever waited beneath Black Hollow, it had drawn orcs and traitorous men together with a purpose too dangerous to ignore. Night settled fully over the ruined village before the rangers allowed themselves even a brief moment of rest. Small fires were kindled only within roofless houses where their glow could not easily be seen from afar, and every flame was carefully shielded against the wind. The rescued families gathered close together, exhausted beyond speech, while the rangers shared what food and water they could spare. Children who had wept during the battle now slept against their mothers' shoulders, unaware of how narrowly death had passed them by. Aragorn moved quietly among them, speaking little, yet every grateful glance reminded him why the Dunedain endured lives hidden from the world. Baranor sat upon a fallen block of stone, examining a rough map scratched into the dust with the point of his knife. Halbarad knelt beside him while Aragorn approached, carrying the strip of parchment recovered from the abandoned camp 2 nights before. Though much of the writing had been ruined by damp, a few faded symbols remained visible beneath the firelight. Baranor studied them for a long while before lifting his eyes. "These are not directions," he said. "They are fragments of old inventory marks used in the days of Arna. Whoever carried this parchment searched records far older than any ordinary outlaw could have found." Aragorn unfolded the map Halbarad had carried from the hidden stores of the rangers and laid it beside the parchment. His finger traced the line of forgotten roads stretching eastward through deserted country until it rested upon a faded mark surrounded by weathered notes written in Sindarin. "Black Hollow," he murmured. Not its true name, but the one later generations gave it after the upper fortress collapsed. Halbarad nodded grimly. "The older name has almost vanished from memory. It guarded one of the hidden signal stations built during the reign of the kings of Arna. If any place still conceals the stone we saw, it is there." One of the rescued travelers slowly approached the rangers, removing his wool cap with respectful hesitation. He was the elderly guide who had led the wagons into the valley, his lined face still pale from the day's terror. "Forgive an old man's interruption," he said, quietly. "When I was a child, my grandfather spoke of Black Hollow. He warned us never to wander near its hills after sunset." Aragorn motioned for him to continue. "He claimed strange lights sometimes burned beneath the earth, though no man lived there. We laughed at his tales then. Tonight, I no longer do." The old man described narrow valleys overgrown with thorn bushes, broken stairways descending beneath ruined walls, and deep wells that echoed long after a stone had vanished into darkness. Much of it sounded like the embroidered stories that country folk often passed from one generation to another, yet hidden among the superstition lay details too precise to dismiss. He remembered a stream flowing beneath an arch of black stone and an ancient oak split by lightning upon the western ridge. Halbarad quietly marked each landmark upon the map. Legends often wrapped themselves around truth, and wise rangers never discarded either too quickly. Before dawn, the rescued families prepared to continue west under the protection of Baranor and 3 other rangers. Their road would eventually lead toward Bree, where stronger walls and watchful eyes offered better hope of surviving the coming winter. Several children waved shyly toward Aragorn as the wagons departed, though they still knew him only as another weather-worn wanderer. A young boy no older than 8 broke free from his mother's hand and hurried back carrying something tightly wrapped in cloth. "My father carved this," he said, offering a small wooden bird. "He said heroes should have gifts." Aragorn accepted it with unexpected gentleness and rested a hand upon the child's shoulder before watching him run back to his family. When the wagons disappeared beyond the western hills, silence returned once more. Only Aragorn, Halbarad, and 4 rangers remained. Their supplies were modest, for speed mattered more than comfort now. Each man carried dried meat, hard bread, spare bowstrings, and enough water to last until the streams of the eastern valleys. They traveled lightly because every unnecessary burden became an enemy upon difficult ground. Before leaving, Aragorn tucked the carved bird safely inside his pack. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow it reminded him that unseen lives depended upon what lay ahead. Their journey eastward carried them through country seldom visited even by the rangers. Ancient forests gave way to rocky uplands, where twisted junipers clung stubbornly to thin soil, and abandoned watchposts overlooked valleys reclaimed by wilderness. More than once they crossed old roads, whose paving stones still endured beneath layers of moss despite centuries of neglect. Aragorn often paused to examine weathered carvings, nearly erased by wind and rain. Every broken pillar and fallen gateway spoke silently of Arna's vanished greatness, and every ruin strengthened his resolve that its last heirs should not fail while breath remained within them. By the second evening, they discovered fresh signs of the enemy. A cooking fire had been extinguished only hours before beside a narrow stream, and scraps of black cloth fluttered from thorn bushes where hurried men had passed. Halbarad found deep wagon ruts pressed into damp earth exactly as before, while another ranger uncovered the remains of a horse that had been slaughtered and butchered with military efficiency rather than desperation. Nothing had been wasted. Even the bones had been cracked open for marrow. "They are driving themselves hard," Halbarad observed. "Whatever awaits at Black Hollow cannot wait many more days." Aragorn wandered farther downstream until he found something that chilled him more than any sign left by orcs. Upon a smooth patch of sand lay the unmistakable footprint of an elf. The boot was light, finely crafted, and left almost no impression despite the soft ground, yet his trained eye recognized it immediately. Nearby stood another print, then a third, all heading east. The stride was long and unhurried, showing neither flight nor pursuit. Whoever had passed this way walked with confidence and alone. He returned to the others carrying no visible concern, but Halbarad noticed the thoughtful look upon his face. After examining the tracks himself, he remained silent for several moments. "Elves seldom stray here without purpose," he finally said. Aragorn agreed. Rivendell lay many leagues away, yet its people quietly watched the wild lands whenever old shadows stirred. If one of Elrond's folk had gone toward Black Hollow alone, it meant the danger reached beyond the concerns of the rangers. It also meant time was slipping away faster than they had feared. Rain began shortly after sunset, falling in steady sheets that blurred the distant hills and turned narrow paths into ribbons of dark mud. Progress slowed, forcing the rangers to climb onto higher ground where exposed stone offered firmer footing. Thunder rolled across the eastern sky, and flashes of pale light briefly revealed jagged ridges rising beyond the mist. Aragorn studied those heights between bursts of rain. Somewhere beyond them lay Black Hollow, hidden beneath broken towers and forgotten stone. Yet another shape had caught his eye during one bright flash of lightning. High upon a distant ridge stood a solitary figure wrapped in a pale cloak, watching the storm without moving. Before Aragorn could call to the others, darkness returned, and the watcher had vanished as completely as though the mountain itself had swallowed them. Morning arrived beneath a ceiling of low grey clouds that trapped the rain among the eastern hills. Water dripped steadily from black pines, and narrow streams overflowed their banks, cutting fresh channels through the rocky slopes. The rangers broke camp before the first hint of daylight, leaving behind no fire, no refuse, and scarcely a footprint to mark their passing. Aragorn led the way through the mist, his eyes searching every ridge where the pale figure had appeared during the storm. The mountain offered no answer, and only the wind moved across its barren heights. By mid-morning, the land grew harsher with every mile. Ancient forests gave way to broken cliffs and steep valleys, where thorn bushes clung stubbornly to cracked stone. The old road had vanished entirely, leaving only scattered blocks of weathered masonry half buried beneath moss and heather. Halbarad paused beside one such stone and brushed away the damp earth with his gloved hand. Beneath it appeared a seven-pointed star carved by the craftsmen of Arna, still sharp despite the passing centuries. "Our fathers walked here," he said quietly. "Whatever lies ahead was once guarded by men of our own blood." Aragorn examined the carving more closely before rising to continue. The direction of the star's upper point had not been chosen at random. It faced east toward a narrow pass hidden between two dark ridges, and faint marks beside it confirmed that the stone had once guided messengers traveling in secret. Few alive would have recognized the sign, but Elrond had preserved such knowledge in Rivendell long after the kingdom itself had fallen. Aragorn felt again the quiet weight of the years spent learning beneath that roof, where old wisdom had never been allowed to fade into legend. Those lessons now proved as valuable as sword or bow. The rangers entered the pass with great caution. Sheer walls rose on either side, forcing them into single file, while loose stones shifted beneath every careful step. Sound carried strangely through the narrow defile, sometimes returning as faint echoes that seemed almost like distant voices. Twice Aragorn halted because he thought he had heard movement ahead, only to discover mountain goats scrambling across impossible ledges high above. Even so, unease remained with him. The place offered too many hiding spots for watchful enemies. Near the highest point of the pass, one of the younger rangers suddenly raised a clenched fist. Everyone stopped without a word. Across a patch of wet clay lay the fresh tracks of several horses, all shod with heavy iron shoes, unlike those commonly used in Bree or the scattered villages of Eriador. The prince pointed eastward, but another set crossed them from the north. Those lighter tracks belonged to only a single horse, and its rider had deliberately circled the larger party before disappearing into the hills again. Aragorn crouched over the crossing trails, studying them in silence. "Someone has been watching them," he murmured. "Not following. Watching." Halbarad scanned the surrounding cliffs. "The elf?" he asked. Aragorn did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the damp earth and lifted something so small that another man might have overlooked it entirely. Resting upon his palm lay a single silver-grey feather, untouched by rain despite the storm that had swept through during the night. It came not from any common bird of the north, but from an arrow's fletching, crafted with extraordinary care. No ranger among them used feathers like these. Aragorn slipped it carefully inside his cloak. Whoever rode alone through these hills wished to remain unseen, yet had left behind a sign that only careful eyes would notice. The pass descended into a wide basin surrounded by black stone ridges. At its center stood the remains of an ancient bridge spanning a swift river swollen by recent rains. 3 arches had once carried travelers safely across, but only one remained intact. The others had collapsed into the torrent below, leaving jagged blocks scattered through the foaming water. As the rangers approached, Aragorn noticed fresh rope marks along the surviving arch. Someone had crossed recently with wagons despite the dangerous condition of the bridge. The enemy had passed this way. They advanced carefully, one at a time, testing every stone before trusting their weight to it. The old bridge groaned beneath them as icy spray rose from the river below. Halfway across, Halbarad suddenly froze and pointed toward the opposite bank. There, half hidden beneath tangled brush, stood a narrow stone pillar bearing the weathered emblem of the kings of Arna. More remarkable still, someone had recently scraped away centuries of moss from its face. Fresh tool marks surrounded the ancient carving. The enemy had not merely traveled this road, they had been searching it. Beyond the bridge, the rangers found the answer. Hidden beneath a fallen slab of granite lay the entrance to a narrow chamber cut into the hillside. Its bronze door had long ago rotted away, leaving only broken hinges and scattered fragments green with age. Inside rested empty shelves carved directly into the stone, along with rusted iron brackets where lamps had once burned. Dust covered nearly everything except the center of the chamber, where recent boot prints surrounded a square space in the floor. Whatever had once rested there was gone. Halbarad knelt beside the empty recess and frowned. "Another signal stone," he said at last. "Or perhaps records that guided those who carried them." Aragorn traced his fingers along the edges of the hollow. Tiny scratches marred the stone, fresh enough that fragments still clung to the corners. Heavy tools had been used to pry something free. Whoever led the orcs had known exactly where to search, and they had succeeded. The realization settled over the rangers like another layer of cold rain. Before anyone spoke again, a voice echoed softly from the entrance. "You have arrived too late for this place, but not too late for the next." Every ranger turned instantly, weapons ready, yet none loosed an arrow. A tall elf stood framed against the pale daylight beyond the doorway, his grey cloak blending so perfectly with the mist that he seemed almost part of it. His bow remained unstrung across his back, and his hands rested calmly at his sides. Aragorn recognized him after only a heartbeat. It was Elladan, one of the sons of Elrond, whose face carried both quiet resolve and the weariness of many sleepless days. Eladan stepped into the chamber, his boots making scarcely a sound upon the ancient floor. "My brother rides another trail," he said, before anyone could question him. "We have hunted the same enemy since they crossed the mountains, but they have moved more swiftly than we expected." His gaze fell upon the empty stone recess, and disappointment briefly shadowed his features. "This is the third hidden station they have uncovered. They search not for treasure, but for the Master Stone beneath Black Hollow. If they claim it, every surviving signal route built by the kings of Arna may be revealed." Aragorn met the elf's steady eyes, and without another word, he understood that the task before them had become far greater than protecting one forgotten ruin. They were racing to preserve the last hidden defenses of the north before they were laid bare to the servants of the enemy. The chamber fell silent after Eladan's warning. Rain tapped softly against the stone outside while the rangers exchanged troubled glances, each understanding the weight of what had just been revealed. Aragorn folded the old map with deliberate care and returned it to Halbarad. "Then we have been following only one hand of the enemy," he said at last. "The greater purpose has always lain ahead of us." Eladan inclined his head. Yes, the raids, the outlaws, even the ambush in the ruined village were all meant to delay those who might stand in their path. They left the empty chamber without lingering, for there was nothing more to learn from walls that had already surrendered their secret. Eladan guided them away from the old road and into country where no visible path remained. He moved through the wilderness with effortless certainty, finding passages between cliffs that appeared impassable until one stood within them. More than once, Aragorn noticed traces of the elf's earlier journey. An almost invisible notch upon a branch, a pebble turned upon its edge, or a tuft of moss pressed flat against stone. Such signs would have escaped every eye except those trained in Rivendell. As they climbed higher into the eastern hills, Eladan quietly explained what he and his brother had discovered. Nearly a month earlier, scouts from Rivendell had found dead orcs near the high pass, their bodies bearing wounds unlike those left by ordinary feuds among their kind. One dying creature had spoken in terror of a captain who served neither Mordor openly nor any mountain chieftain. Instead, he commanded scattered bands through fear, promising forgotten power hidden beneath the ruins of Arna. Elrond himself had feared that old knowledge preserved in the north might have been uncovered by darker minds. He had therefore sent his sons to learn the truth before the danger could grow. Halbarad listened closely while keeping watch over the surrounding slopes. "Do you know this captain's name?" he asked. Eladan's expression remained thoughtful. Only the title his followers whisper. They call him the Ash Warden. The elf spoke the words without emphasis, yet they seemed to linger strangely upon the mountain air. He was once a man of Gondor, if our reports are true. Learned, patient, skilled in the histories of Númenor. Somewhere during his years of wandering, his loyalty was consumed by ambition. Aragorn frowned. A man who understood the ancient kingdoms would indeed know where to search for hidden relics. Toward midday, they reached a narrow shelf overlooking a broad valley. Black Hollow lay beyond it, though the fortress itself remained concealed by folds of land and thick forest. Eladan motioned for silence before leading them to the edge of the cliff. Below, nearly half a mile away, enemy wagons crawled slowly along an old causeway toward a dark ridge crowned by broken towers. Orcs marched beside them in disciplined columns, while armed men guarded both flanks. Smoke rose from several campfires already established near the entrance to the ruins. The Ash Warden had arrived. Aragorn studied the enemy with growing concern. Their numbers had increased considerably since the battle in the ruined village. More than 50 orcs could now be counted, along with perhaps 30 men carrying proper shields and mail instead of the ragged equipment worn by common outlaws. Several wagons bore heavy wooden crates bound with iron bands, while another carried something wrapped beneath layers of thick canvas. The outline beneath the covering matched the shape of the ancient stone Aragorn had seen in the ravine. "They have gathered more than one relic," he observed quietly. Elladan nodded. 3 signal stones, perhaps 4. Alone they reveal little. Together they may guide the bearer toward the master stone beneath Black Hollow. He pointed toward the shattered fortress rising beyond the valley. Once it had been a proud watchpost of Arna, guarding the eastern approaches through a chain of beacon towers stretching across the north. Now only fragments remained above ground. Great sections of the walls had collapsed down the hillside, and trees grew from cracks where soldiers had once stood watch. Yet beneath those ruins extended vaults and passages carved directly into living rock, protected by the builders against siege and time alike. The rangers withdrew from the cliff before any wandering sentries could notice them. Beneath the shelter of wind-shaped pines, they gathered around a rough map drawn with charcoal upon smooth stone. Elladan outlined the fortress as he remembered it from ancient records preserved in Rivendell. A central hall lay beneath the largest tower, connected to underground passages leading toward the deepest chamber where the Master Stone had once rested. Many entrances had collapsed during earthquakes long ago, but at least one secret passage remained open. "If the Ash Warden finds that route before we do," Elladan said, "he will reach the chamber without ever exposing his army to the main defenses." Baranor's absence weighed heavily upon Aragorn at that moment. More rangers would have strengthened any assault, yet waiting for reinforcements was impossible. Every hour allowed the enemy to dig deeper into the ruins. Halbarad broke the silence first. "We cannot defeat them in open battle." Aragorn agreed immediately. "Nor must we try. Our task is not to destroy an army. It is to keep the Master Stone beyond their reach." Elladan looked from one face to another before speaking. "Then we enter before nightfall and force them to follow us beneath the fortress." No man welcomed the plan, yet none proposed another. The rangers spent the remaining hours sharpening blades, checking bowstrings, and preparing what little equipment they possessed for fighting underground. Torches were wrapped in waxed cloth to keep them dry. Rope was divided among the company, and each man carried a small pouch of chalk to mark passages in the darkness. Aragorn removed the carved wooden bird from his pack for a brief moment, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. He remembered the child who had placed it in his hand only days before, and quietly tucked it away again. There could be no turning back now. As evening approached, heavy clouds once more gathered above the eastern hills, dimming the light long before sunset. The company descended through dense woodland until the broken towers of Black Hollow loomed before them. Ivy smothered the shattered walls, while ancient pines had forced their roots through cracked foundations built by forgotten kings. Ravens circled silently above the tallest ruin, refusing to settle upon its stones. Even the wind seemed reluctant to enter the place, flowing around the fortress rather than through it. Aragorn felt the age of the ruin pressing upon him like an unseen weight. Elladan halted beside an enormous oak whose trunk had split centuries earlier beneath a lightning strike. Hidden behind tangled roots lay a narrow opening scarcely wide enough for one man to enter. Moss concealed its edges so completely that Aragorn would never have found it unaided. A cool breath of air drifted from the darkness below, carrying the scent of damp stone, untouched by sunlight for generations. The elf knelt beside the entrance and brushed away loose earth, revealing ancient steps descending into blackness. "This passage was built for messengers alone," he whispered. "If fortune favors us, the Ash Warden has not yet discovered it." One by one, the rangers disappeared beneath the earth, their torchlight swallowed almost immediately by the deep passage. Aragorn entered last, pausing only long enough to glance back toward the valley below. In the distance, he could see the enemy camp preparing for the night, unaware that their greatest foes already moved beneath their feet. He lowered the concealed entrance behind him until the forest vanished from sight, leaving only darkness, ancient stone, and the echo of quiet footsteps descending into the forgotten heart of Black Hollow. The narrow stair descended far deeper than Aragorn had expected. The steps had been carved directly into solid rock with such precision that even after centuries they remained firm beneath his boots, though water had polished their edges smooth. Their torches cast wavering light across walls engraved with faded stars, crowned trees, and the winged emblems of the kings of Arna. Dust lay thick upon the passage, disturbed only by the fresh footprints of the company. The silence below the earth possessed a strange weight, broken only by the steady drip of water and the distant whisper of unseen currents flowing through the mountain. Elladan led the way without hesitation, counting intersections from memory rather than by sight. At every branching passage, he paused only long enough to compare the ancient carvings with what had survived in Rivendell's records. Time had spared some signs while erasing others completely, forcing him to rely upon instinct as much as learning. Aragorn watched the elf with quiet admiration. The sons of Elrond had walked the wilds of Middle-earth for many lifetimes of men, and their knowledge reached back into ages that existed for Aragorn only in songs and chronicles. The passage widened into a vaulted corridor lined with broken stone statues. Most had toppled from their pedestals long ago, their faces shattered by falling masonry or deliberate blows. One figure alone still stood upright, though its head had been struck away centuries earlier. Aragorn paused before it, brushing soot from the carved breastplate. Beneath the grime appeared the white tree, surrounded by 7 stars. They tried to erase every sign of the kingdom, Halbarad murmured beside him. Aragorn nodded silently. Hatred often sought not only to conquer, but to make the conquered forgotten. As they pressed onward, the air grew noticeably colder. A faint current drifted through the halls from somewhere far below, carrying the scent of ancient stone mixed with something less pleasant. It was the smell of smoke, not fresh smoke from campfires, but the lingering odor of burning oil that had seeped into the walls over many hours. Elladan immediately extinguished his torch with a damp cloth, and the others followed without question. They continued in darkness, broken only by the pale glow filtering through cracks high above, moving with one hand against the wall until another faint light appeared ahead. The source proved to be a chamber, unlike any they had yet entered. Tall pillars supported a domed ceiling, painted long ago with stars that still shimmered faintly, despite the passage of centuries. At the center stood a circular table carved from a single slab of black stone, its surface covered with maps incised so deeply that neither time nor weather could erase them. Small bronze markers rested upon several routes crossing the north, each bearing tiny inscriptions in the old tongue of Númenor. Aragorn realized with a quiet thrill that this had once been a planning chamber where the wardens of Arnor coordinated the defense of the frontier. Elladan examined the table quickly before his expression darkened. 2 of the bronze markers were missing. Their outlines remained visible in the dust where they had rested undisturbed for generations until very recently. Nearby lay fragments of broken wax from a lantern, along with fresh boot prints leading toward another corridor. "They have already searched this room," the elf said in a low voice. "They take everything connected with the signal network." Halbarad frowned as he studied the empty spaces. Yet they left the maps themselves. Aragorn traced one carved road with his fingertips. Because they already know where to go. A sudden scraping sound echoed faintly through the stone halls. Every man froze where he stood. The noise came again, followed by the muffled clatter of iron against rock somewhere beyond the eastern wall. Aragorn quietly signaled the others to extinguish even the smallest remaining light. Darkness swallowed the chamber as they withdrew behind the nearest pillars. Moments later, voices drifted toward them through an adjoining passage. Orcs. Their harsh speech echoed strangely within the vaults, accompanied by the shuffle of many boots and the creak of heavy wagons being dragged across uneven stone. The column passed within 30 paces of the hidden rangers. Torchlight flickered across the entrance, revealing 6 orcs straining against thick ropes attached to a low wooden sledge. Resting upon it lay another carved stone wrapped in leather and iron chains. Behind them walked several men carrying picks, hammers, and bundles of timber. One complained bitterly about the narrow tunnels. Another answered that the Ash Warden wished every relic brought before midnight, whether the labor killed them or not. Their words faded slowly into the depths until only the scraping of the sledge remained. Aragorn waited until the echoes disappeared completely before stepping from concealment. "They are gathering everything in one place," he whispered. Elladan agreed, though concern now clouded his usually calm features. "Which means the master chamber cannot be far ahead." They followed the fresh tracks with even greater caution, leaving the old planning hall behind. Every corridor now showed unmistakable signs of recent activity. Broken doors lay splintered across the floors, discarded tools leaned against ancient walls, and soot from dozens of torches blackened ceilings that had remained untouched for centuries. The tunnels gradually descended into older sections of the fortress, where the stonework became finer and more elaborate. Great arches rose overhead, decorated with carved leaves and flowing script that neither orc nor outlaw had troubled to destroy. Here and there stood bronze braziers, shaped like blooming flowers, green with age, yet still beautiful beneath layers of dust. Aragorn imagined the halls as they must once have appeared, alive with messengers hurrying between chambers, while beacon reports traveled across the north. That forgotten order had endured for generations before ruin claimed it, and now strangers sought to twist its purpose toward darkness. Without warning, Elladan raised a hand. Ahead, the passage divided around a massive stone pillar before joining again beyond it. Between the two branches stood an ancient bronze door, unlike any they had passed before. Though tarnished and scarred by time, it remained firmly shut. Across its surface stretched intricate carvings of 7 towers linked by lines of flame, while beneath them appeared an inscription in the ancient tongue. Aragorn stepped closer, reading the weathered words aloud in a quiet voice. "Let no hand open what serves only the faithful." Halbarad looked toward the tracks disappearing around the pillar. "Then why has the enemy passed it by?" Elladan rested his hand lightly upon the cold bronze. "Because this is not the way they seek," he replied. "Or perhaps they cannot open it." Before another word could be spoken, a distant shout echoed through the halls ahead, followed by the unmistakable ring of steel striking steel. Another voice answered in pain, then abruptly fell silent. Aragorn and the others exchanged sharp glances. Someone else was already fighting within the depths of Black Hollow, and the sound had come from the very direction in which the enemy had gone. With weapons drawn and every sense alert, the company left the unopened bronze door behind and hurried toward the growing echoes of battle that rolled through the forgotten halls like thunder beneath the mountain. The echoes of battle guided the company through a maze of ancient corridors that twisted beneath the heart of Black Hollow. Each clang of steel rolled along the stone passages, sometimes sounding close enough to touch before fading into distant darkness. Aragorn advanced at the front, beside Elladan, their pace quick but measured, for haste beneath the earth could prove deadlier than any waiting enemy. The floor sloped steadily downward, and the air grew colder with every turn. Somewhere ahead, men were fighting for their lives, and every passing heartbeat threatened to make the outcome irreversible. The passage opened suddenly into a vast underground hall supported by towering pillars shaped like the trunks of mighty trees, their branches spread across the ceiling in carved stone, meeting overhead to form graceful arches that had survived the ruin of the fortress above. Fallen blocks littered the floor where earthquakes had shaken loose parts of the roof long ago, creating islands of broken masonry amid broad stretches of worn flagstone. Torches burned at irregular intervals, filling the chamber with wavering orange light and long, shifting shadows. The smell of smoke mingled with damp stone and the sharp scent of fresh blood. Near the center of the hall, a desperate fight was already underway. 4 elves stood with their backs to an ancient fountain whose waters had long since dried away, defending themselves against nearly 20 orcs. Their movements possessed the effortless grace of Rivendell, every stroke precise and controlled, yet even their skill could not erase the disadvantage of numbers. 2 orcs already lay dead upon the floor, while another writhed in pain beside a shattered column. One of the elves bore a deep cut across his left arm, though he continued fighting without hesitation. Aragorn recognized the tallest among them at once. It was Elrohir, Elladan's brother. Elladan did not hesitate. With a sharp cry in Sindarin, he rushed forward, bow abandoned, as his sword flashed into the torchlight. His voice carried through the hall like a clear bell, and the surrounded elves answered with renewed determination. Aragorn and the rangers charged beside him, striking the orcs before they realized fresh enemies had entered the battle. The sudden attack shattered the tight ring around Elrohir's company. Halbarad's first arrow found the throat of an orc, reaching for one of the wounded elves, while Aragorn drove another backward with a powerful stroke that sent its rusted shield skidding across the stone. The fight spread rapidly through the chamber. Orcs shouted in confusion as they struggled to face attacks from 2 directions at once. Aragorn moved swiftly between the pillars, refusing to become trapped among the enemy. Every blow he struck served a purpose, opening space for another defender or preventing an orc from reaching the elves at the fountain. A heavy spear grazed his shoulder, slicing through cloak and leather before glancing harmlessly aside. He ignored the sting completely, focusing instead upon the next attacker rushing through the smoke. Across the hall, Elladan reached his brother at last. Their reunion lasted no longer than a heartbeat before another wave of orcs crashed against them. Fighting side by side, the sons of Elrond seemed almost impossible to separate, each anticipating the other's movements with effortless precision. One orc raised an axe against Elladan's unguarded side, only for Elrohir to intercept the blow before it landed. Another lunged toward Elrohir from behind a fallen pillar, but Elladan's blade turned the attack aside before the orc had completed the thrust. Years beyond counting had forged their bond into something that scarcely required speech. At last, the surviving orcs faltered. Their captain, seeing nearly half his warriors fallen, gave a furious order in the black speech and began withdrawing toward a broad tunnel leading deeper beneath the fortress. Unlike lesser bands that fled in blind panic, these creatures retreated in disciplined formation, shielding one another as they disappeared into the darkness. Aragorn started after them, but Elrohir caught his arm. "Let them go," he said, breathing hard though his voice remained steady. "They retreat toward the place we must reach. Chasing blindly will only lead us into another snare." The defenders gathered around the dry fountain, while Halbarad and the younger rangers quickly tended the wounded. One elf had suffered a broken rib, another a cut across his thigh, yet none had received wounds that prevented them from continuing. Elrohir knelt beside a fallen orc captain and searched the creature's pouch with practiced hands. From within, he withdrew a small bronze key engraved with the 7-pointed star of Arna. He frowned as he turned it over beneath the torchlight. "This was not taken as plunder," he said quietly. "Someone knew exactly where to find it." Elladan glanced toward the dark tunnel into which the enemy had vanished. "We feared as much. My company discovered the Ash Warden's scouts 3 days ago searching the lower vaults. We delayed them where we could, but they outnumbered us and knew more of these halls than seemed possible." Aragorn listened carefully while examining the chamber itself. Upon the far wall, partly concealed behind fallen stone, he noticed another inscription, carved in elegant letters far older than the fortress above. Time had worn many of the words away, but one phrase remained clear. It named this place the Hall of Messengers. Elrohir followed Aragorn's gaze and nodded. Every warning sent through the northern signal towers passed through this hall before reaching the kings of Arna. The master chamber lies beneath it. He spoke the last words with quiet certainty. Yet there is another way below, one not shown upon the maps preserved in Rivendell. Halbarad looked up sharply from binding a wounded ranger's arm. "How do you know that?" Elrohir reached inside his cloak and unfolded a weathered fragment of parchment, unlike any Aragorn had seen before. Its edges were burned, and much of the writing had faded beyond recognition, but a carefully drawn passage remained visible. "I found this upon a dead messenger near the eastern slopes," Elrohir explained. "Not one of ours, one of theirs. He died before reaching the Ash Warden." Aragorn studied the fragment with growing unease. Someone within the enemy force had carried detailed knowledge of Black Hollow's hidden passages, knowledge copied from records that should have been lost centuries earlier. The route marked upon the parchment bypassed the fortress entirely, descending beneath the oldest foundations toward the deepest vaults. If genuine, it offered the enemy a direct path to the master chamber. Before anyone could speak again, a low rumble shuddered through the stone beneath their feet. Dust drifted from the carved ceiling as another tremor followed, stronger than the first. The torches flickered wildly, and somewhere far below came the unmistakable crash of collapsing masonry. Every face turned toward the dark tunnel, leading deeper underground. Elrohir's expression hardened. They have begun breaking through the final barrier. Aragorn tightened his grip upon his sword, feeling the mountain itself awaken around them. Whatever ancient gate had protected the master chamber for centuries, the Ash Warden was now forcing it open. The trembling beneath the mountain faded as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only drifting dust and an uneasy silence in its wake. Tiny fragments of stone continued to fall from the vaulted ceiling, clicking softly against the ancient floor before coming to rest. Every man and elf in the hall listened intently, hoping the shaking had ended, yet the stillness that followed seemed almost more troubling than the rumble itself. Aragorn placed one hand against a nearby pillar and felt a faint vibration lingering deep within the rock. Somewhere below them, iron and stone were still meeting with relentless force. "There is no more time," Elrohir said, rolling the damaged parchment with swift, practiced movements. "If they have reached the last gate, they will not stop until it yields." Elladan examined the rough map one final time before handing it to Aragorn. "The hidden passage begins beyond the Hall of Messengers. It was built for the king's own couriers, should the fortress above ever fall." Halbarad glanced toward the tunnel where the orcs had retreated. "And if they already know of it, Elladan's answer came without hesitation. "Then we must arrive before they do." The company moved out at once, leaving only 2 lightly wounded rangers behind to guard the chamber and aid any who might retreat. Their path led through a narrow arch, concealed behind the shattered remains of an enormous stone tapestry carved to resemble flowing cloth. Beyond it stretched a descending corridor, untouched by recent footsteps. Dust lay thick across the floor, broken only now by the careful prints of the rangers and the elves. The walls here bore no decoration beyond simple lines of polished granite, yet the craftsmanship remained extraordinary. Every joint fitted so perfectly that not even the edge of a knife could pass between the stones. After several hundred paces, the corridor narrowed until they were forced to walk in single file. The ceiling dipped low, and the air became noticeably colder, carrying the scent of deep water and ancient earth. Aragorn's torch revealed small channels cut into the floor, where clear streams still flowed quietly toward unseen depths. The builders had planned for endurance rather than comfort, creating passages that could remain dry even if the upper fortress collapsed. More than once, Aragorn found himself wondering how many generations of craftsmen had labored beneath this mountain. Their work had survived long after their names had faded from memory. The passage ended at a massive circular door of dark stone that had not moved in centuries. Unlike the bronze gate they had passed earlier, this barrier possessed no lock or visible handle. Instead, 7 shallow recesses had been carved around its edge, each shaped to receive a small object. Elrohir withdrew the bronze key taken from the fallen orc captain and examined the nearest hollow. It matched perfectly. He inserted the key and turned it slowly. A deep, metallic click echoed through the chamber, followed by the grinding sound of ancient mechanisms awakening after ages of silence. Nothing else happened. Halbarad frowned and inspected the remaining 6 recesses. "One key cannot open this door." Elladan ran his fingers across the worn carvings surrounding the stone. 7 wardens, 7 keys. His voice carried quiet disappointment. The kings trusted no single guardian with this passage. Aragorn studied the empty hollows, his thoughts moving rapidly. If the Ash Warden had already uncovered several hidden stations, then he had likely recovered other keys as well. The enemy had not been collecting relics at random. Every discovery had brought them one step closer to this very place. Before discouragement could take hold, Aragorn noticed something unusual near the base of the door. One section of the stone bore fresh scratches, unlike the smooth wear left by time. He knelt, holding his torch lower, and found tiny fragments of broken iron scattered across the floor. Someone had attempted to force the door open with heavy tools. The effort had failed, but it proved that the enemy had reached this place before abandoning it. Aragorn followed the marks with his eyes until they disappeared beneath a narrow crack in the wall to the right of the doorway. He approached the crack carefully and pressed his shoulder against the stone beside it. A faint current of cool air brushed across his face. The wall was not solid. It concealed a narrow opening, hidden so skillfully that only damage caused by the failed attempt to breach the main door had revealed its outline. Aragorn searched the edges until his fingers found a small depression worn smooth by countless hands centuries earlier. He pressed inward. With a quiet groan, a section of the wall swung slowly aside, revealing a passage scarcely wide enough for one man to enter. Elladan allowed himself a brief smile. The builders expected even the wardens to fail one day. He extinguished his torch before stepping into the hidden corridor, relying instead upon the faint blue glow that filtered from strange crystals embedded high within the rock. The others followed in silence. Unlike the broad halls above, this passage twisted sharply through natural caverns that had been carefully shaped rather than fully carved. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling into dark pools where the pale light shimmered like distant stars. The mountain itself seemed older here than any kingdom built upon it. After nearly half an hour, the corridor widened into a natural cavern, dominated by an underground river flowing swiftly through its center. A graceful stone bridge spanned the water, its single arch rising high above the current. On the far side stood another doorway, this one already open. Fresh torchlight flickered beyond it, casting long shadows across the bridge. Aragorn immediately raised a warning hand. Someone had passed through only moments before. The company crossed with every weapon ready. Halfway over, Halbarad knelt suddenly and touched the stone with 2 fingers. A dark stain marked the bridge nor its center. Blood, still wet. Just beyond it lay a broken orc spear, snapped cleanly in 2. The sign spoke clearly without need of words. A struggle had taken place here very recently, and it had ended quickly. Yet there were no bodies, only scattered drops leading through the open doorway ahead. They entered cautiously, expecting another attack at every step. Instead, they found a long chamber, lined with shelves cut into the walls, each holding sealed clay cylinders protected by layers of dust. Hundreds remained untouched despite the passing centuries, but many more had been shattered recently, their fragments littering the floor. Scrolls lay scattered everywhere, trampled beneath muddy boots and stained by dripping torch pitch. Aragorn picked up one damaged parchment and carefully unrolled it. Though much of the writing had faded, he recognized detailed maps showing hidden ranger paths that had once linked the watchposts of Arna. Elladan's face darkened as he surveyed the destruction. "The archives," he said quietly. This was the true heart of the signal network. Elrohir stooped beside another broken shelf and lifted a torn scroll whose edges had been hastily ripped away. "They searched for something specific," he observed. "Not every record. Only those concerning the master chamber." At that very moment, a distant voice echoed faintly through the stone beyond the far wall. It was calm, confident, and unmistakably human. Though the words themselves could not yet be understood, Aragorn knew without doubt that he was hearing the Ash Warden for the first time, speaking somewhere just beyond the ancient archives as the final stage of his long search drew near. Every man and elf in the chamber became perfectly still as the distant voice drifted through the ancient stone. It was not loud, nor did it carry the harsh command of an orc chieftain. Instead, it possessed a measured confidence, the voice of someone accustomed to obedience without needing to shout. The words themselves remained indistinct, broken by thick walls and winding passages. Yet their calm certainty unsettled Aragorn more than any battle cry could have done. An enemy who remained composed at the threshold of victory was often the most dangerous of all. Elladan motioned for silence and moved toward the far wall where the sound had originated. Behind a row of shattered archive shelves, partly hidden beneath collapsed masonry, lay a narrow doorway whose heavy stone slab had been pushed aside only recently. Fresh scrape marks scored the floor, and tiny fragments of broken mortar still rested where they had fallen. Aragorn crouched beside the opening and placed his hand upon the stone. It retained a faint warmth. Someone had passed through only moments before. The company slipped into the passage one by one, leaving the ruined archives behind. Unlike the carefully built corridors above, this tunnel wound through the living rock itself, its walls rough and untouched by decorative carving. Here and there, the builders had strengthened weak sections with fitted blocks of granite, but much of the mountain remained exposed. The air carried a deep, steady hum that seemed to rise from beneath their feet, almost too low to hear, yet impossible to ignore. Halbarad frowned as he listened. "Water," he whispered. "A great deal of it." The passage curved sharply before opening onto a high ledge overlooking an immense cavern. Aragorn stopped immediately, drawing the others back into shadow before anyone stepped into view. Below them stretched the oldest part of Black Hollow, untouched by daylight since the first stones of the fortress had been laid. At the cavern's center stood a vast circular platform surrounded by dark water flowing in slow silence. 7 stone bridges reached toward it from different directions, like the spokes of a great wheel, though 3 had collapsed into the depths long ago. Upon the central platform rose a single tower of polished black stone that reached nearly to the cavern ceiling. Torchlight filled the cavern below. Orcs labored across the surviving bridges, hauling heavy crates and ancient relics toward the central tower under the watchful eyes of armed men. The signal stones Aragorn had seen during the long pursuit now rested upon carved pedestals, arranged around the tower in careful order. Each had been cleaned of dirt and moss until the old Númenórean runes shone clearly beneath the firelight. More unsettling still, several scholars in dark robes knelt beside them, comparing faded scrolls while the orcs guarded every approach. This was no chaotic plundering of forgotten ruins. It was a carefully prepared excavation, guided by knowledge patiently gathered over many years. Standing near the entrance of the tower was the man they had hunted across Eriador. The Ash Warden wore no crown or splendid armor. His dark traveling cloak hung simply over well-made mail, and a plain sword rested at his side. Grey touched his hair at the temples, while his face bore the weathered lines of long roads rather than the softness of noble halls. He looked more like a learned captain than a servant of darkness, yet there was something cold within his steady gaze that reminded Aragorn of winter rivers. This was a man who measured lives as obstacles rather than burdens. The Ash Warden accepted a scroll from one of his followers and studied it briefly before speaking. His words carried clearly across the cavern. "The 4th alignment is correct. Prepare the final stone." His voice remained calm, almost scholarly, as though discussing architecture rather than awakening forgotten power. One of the robed men bowed respectfully. "Lord, the last inscription differs from the others." The Ash Warden barely glanced toward him. "Then we shall teach it to agree." Aragorn watched in growing concern as several orcs carried the final signal stone toward the empty pedestal nearest the tower. Unlike the others, this stone bore a long crack running from top to bottom, where age or violence had nearly broken it apart. Even damaged, its carved symbols retained an austere beauty impossible to mistake. Elladan leaned close enough that only Aragorn could hear him. "Once the 7 are placed correctly, the Master Stone may answer them." Aragorn's grip tightened upon his sword. "Then we cannot allow the 7th to stand." Before anyone could act, movement upon the opposite side of the cavern drew Aragorn's attention. 2 prisoners were being led across one of the remaining bridges beneath heavy guard. Both wore the travel-stained cloaks of rangers, their hands bound behind them with iron chains. One stumbled from exhaustion, yet the other remained upright despite blood running freely from a wound upon his brow. Aragorn recognized him with a tightening in his chest. It was Dorlus, an experienced ranger who had disappeared weeks earlier while patrolling the eastern frontier. Halbarad saw him at the same moment and drew a slow breath through clenched teeth. The prisoners were forced to kneel before the Ash Warden. For several moments the captain regarded them in complete silence. Then he spoke with the same measured tone that never seemed to rise in anger. "You have served your people faithfully. Tell me where the final warden's key was hidden, and the suffering of your companion will end." Dorlus lifted his head, despite the blood upon his face. His answer came quietly, but without hesitation. "You have searched the bones of a dead kingdom. You will find only dust." A faint smile touched the Ash Warden's lips, though no warmth accompanied it. He turned instead toward the second prisoner, a much younger ranger whose face betrayed both fear and determination. "Loyalty is admirable," the captain said. "It is also predictable." He nodded once toward an orc guard. The creature raised its spear, not toward the younger prisoner, but toward Dorlus instead. The older ranger understood immediately what was intended. Without taking his eyes from the Ash Warden, he called firmly to his companion. "Remember your oath. Whatever happens, remember." The younger man's jaw trembled, yet he slowly closed his eyes and said nothing. Aragorn's heart pounded with the effort of remaining still. Every instinct urged him to charge across the nearest bridge, yet reason held him fast. Between the ledge and the central platform waited dozens of orcs, disciplined soldiers, and bridges so narrow that only a handful could cross abreast. A reckless assault would doom not only the prisoners, but everyone beside him. Elladan laid a steady hand upon Aragorn's arm, silently understanding the struggle within him. There would be one chance, perhaps only one, and it had not yet come. The Ash Warden regarded Dorlus for another long moment before lowering his hand. The orc withdrew its spear without striking. "You mistake me," the captain said almost gently. "I have no need of your answers any longer." He looked toward the 7 pedestals surrounding the tower. "The mountain itself is about to speak." As though answering his words, a deep vibration rolled through the cavern. The signal stones began to glow with a pale silver light beneath their carved runes, and somewhere within the black tower, a vast mechanism awakened with a sound like distant thunder echoing through the heart of the earth. The silver light spread slowly from one signal stone to the next until the entire ring surrounding the black tower shimmered with a pale radiance. Ancient runes awakened one after another, glowing like moonlight reflected upon still water rather than the harsh blaze of ordinary fire. Deep within the tower came the steady turning of hidden gears that had not moved since the fall of Arna. Dust drifted from high arches as the old machinery answered commands spoken by no living king. Every sound echoed through the cavern with solemn purpose, as though the mountain itself remembered the hands that had built it. The Ash Warden watched the awakening mechanism with quiet satisfaction. He neither laughed nor raised his voice in triumph, for this moment was the fulfillment of years spent searching forgotten libraries, bribing desperate men, and driving orcs across the wilderness. One of the robed scholars approached him cautiously, clutching a weathered scroll with trembling hands. "Lord," the man whispered, "the alignment is nearly complete, but the final sequence remains uncertain." The Ash Warden accepted the scroll without looking away from the glowing stones. Then uncertainty ends now. Aragorn studied every movement from the shadowed ledge above. The enemy's attention rested entirely upon the tower, and for the first time since entering the cavern, their formation had loosened. Orc guards drifted closer to the central platform, eager to witness whatever their master had uncovered. Several bridges now stood less heavily defended than before. Elladan noticed the same weakness. He leaned close and spoke so softly that only the rangers and elves beside him could hear. "We cannot stop the mechanism from here. We must reach the tower itself." Halbarad quickly surveyed the surviving bridges. 3 remained standing, though only one offered a route concealed for part of its length behind massive stone supports. "That bridge," he murmured. "If we move before they tighten the guard again, we may reach the platform unnoticed." Elrohir nodded once. "My company will draw their eyes elsewhere." Aragorn looked toward him immediately. "The risk is too great." A faint smile touched the elf's face. "It would be greater to do nothing." Without another word, Elrohir gathered the 4 elves who had fought beside him in the Hall of Messengers. They disappeared silently into another passage overlooking the cavern from the opposite side. Aragorn counted the slow breaths between their departure and whatever came next. 1, 2, 3. Then the sharp song of an elven bowstring rang through the darkness. The first arrow struck a torch, fixed beside the western bridge, scattering burning oil across the stone. Before the startled orcs understood what had happened, a second volley descended from above. Torches shattered, ropes snapped, and startled cries echoed through the cavern as several guards fell. The sudden attack threw the enemy into confusion. Orcs rushed toward the western passages while shouting contradictory orders, believing a much larger force had descended upon them. The Ash Warden spun toward the disturbance, his calm expression hardening for the first time. "Now," Aragorn whispered. The rangers and Elladan sprang from concealment, racing toward the partially hidden bridge. Their boots scarcely touched the ancient stone as they crossed the narrow span above the dark water. The roar of confused battle elsewhere in the cavern concealed the sound of their approach. Twice, Aragorn was forced to duck behind broken pillars as wandering orcs glanced in his direction. Yet neither guard looked long enough to recognize the danger. The distraction had come at precisely the right moment. They reached the central platform before the alarm truly spread. Only 6 orcs remained guarding the nearest approach, their attention divided between the western attack and the glowing tower behind them. Aragorn charged the nearest before the creature could raise its horn. His sword flashed once, knocking the instrument from its grasp, then again to drive the orc backward across the polished stone. Halbarad and the rangers struck almost simultaneously, overwhelming the startled guards before they could form a proper defense. The brief clash ended as quickly as it had begun, though one dying orc managed to utter a harsh cry that carried across the cavern. The Ash Warden turned instantly. His eyes met Aragorn's across the circle of glowing stones, and for a long heartbeat, neither man moved. Recognition flickered across the captain's weathered face, not because he knew Aragorn's true name, but because he finally understood who had undone his plans again and again across Eriador. "The ranger," he said quietly. "I expected you sooner." Aragorn advanced without lowering his sword. "Your road ends here." The Ash Warden regarded him with almost thoughtful curiosity. "No, it merely reaches the place where stronger men decide the fate of weaker ones." He stepped backward toward the entrance of the Black Tower while raising one hand to his followers. At once the scholars retreated inside, carrying their precious scrolls, while fresh companies of orcs poured onto the platform from hidden doors Aragorn had not noticed before. The captain had anticipated that someone might reach him eventually. His final defenses had been waiting all along. Elladan loosed arrow after arrow into the advancing line, but every fallen orc was quickly replaced by another climbing onto the platform. Then the mountain shook with greater violence than before. The 7 signal stones blazed so brightly that every face in the cavern was washed in silver light. A deep crack split the floor between the pedestals, running directly toward the entrance of the tower. Ancient locks hidden beneath the stone released one after another with deafening force. The great black doors slowly began to swing inward, revealing only darkness beyond. From somewhere far below came the sound of rushing water and the groan of vast mechanisms completing their final movement after lying silent for 1,000 years. The Ash Warden stood before the opening with absolute confidence. He looked once more toward Aragorn, then inclined his head with the courtesy of one warrior acknowledging another before battle. "You have courage," he said. "Let us discover whether courage is enough." With that, he disappeared into the darkness beyond the opened doors. At the same instant, dozens of orcs surged forward to block the entrance, and Aragorn realized that if the captain reached the Master Stone first, everything they had endured since entering Black Hollow would have been in vain. The orcs crashed forward in a black tide, filling the entrance of the tower with shields and jagged spears before Aragorn could follow the Ash Warden. Their harsh cries echoed through the cavern as they fought with desperate determination, no longer seeking merely to delay, but to prevent anyone from reaching their master. Aragorn met the first rank head-on, his sword driving aside a spear before cutting through the narrow gap between shield and helm. Halbarad and the rangers closed beside him without breaking stride, while Elladan's arrows struck the rear ranks with deadly precision. The narrow entrance worked against the orcs as much as against their enemies, allowing only a handful to fight at once. The struggle became a brutal contest, measured in feet rather than yards. Every step forward cost sweat, strength, and blood. Fallen orcs quickly blocked the threshold, forcing those behind them to climb over their own dead, while the rangers pressed relentlessly onward. Aragorn felt his shoulders burn from repeated blows against heavy shields, and more than once an orc blade scraped harmlessly across his mail. There was no room for elegant swordplay in the confined space. Victory belonged to discipline, endurance, and the refusal to surrender, even when every muscle cried out for rest. At last, the final defenders broke beneath the pressure. One surviving orc threw down its weapon and fled into the darkness, only to disappear beneath a collapsing section of ancient stone loosened by the trembling mountain. Aragorn wasted no time pursuing it. He crossed the threshold of the tower with Halbarad, Elladan, and Elrohir close behind, while the remaining rangers secured the entrance against any enemy still fighting within the cavern. Beyond the great doors stretched a circular chamber unlike anything Aragorn had ever seen beneath the earth. The walls rose smooth and unbroken toward a domed ceiling where silver stars had been set into the stone itself, their light reflected by polished black marble beneath their feet. At the center of the chamber stood a single pedestal carved from white granite. Resting upon it was the Master Stone. Larger than the others by several times, it shimmered with an inner light that pulsed gently like the steady beating of a living heart. Fine lines of silver spread from it through the floor in every direction, vanishing into channels that connected with the signal stones outside. It was not a weapon, nor a source of magical destruction. It was the heart of an ancient network built to preserve, protect, and unite the kingdoms of the north. The Ash Warden stood before the pedestal, one hand resting lightly upon its smooth surface. Several opened scrolls lay scattered around him, while bronze keys and carved markers had been arranged in careful order upon the floor. He looked almost peaceful as he regarded the glowing stone. "At last," he said quietly, not turning around. The wisdom of Westerness should never have been buried beneath forgotten ruins. Slowly he faced Aragorn, his expression calm despite the battle raging beyond the tower. "You believe I seek conquest? You are mistaken. I seek knowledge, and knowledge belongs to those strong enough to preserve it." Aragorn advanced until only a few paces separated them. "Knowledge without honor becomes another weapon," he answered. "You have marched beside orcs, slaughtered the innocent, and betrayed everything your forefathers defended." The Ash Warden neither denied nor excused those deeds. History remembers those who succeed, not those who hesitate. His hand tightened upon the Master Stone. Arnor fell because its guardians clung to old virtues while their enemies adapted. I will not repeat their failure. His sword came free with a smooth motion, its polished blade catching the pale light flowing from the ancient relic. The duel began without another word. The Ash Warden fought unlike the savage captains Aragorn had faced before. Every movement was precise, patient, and economical, revealing long years of disciplined training. He did not rely upon overwhelming strength, but upon timing and careful observation, forcing Aragorn to defend rather than attack. Their blades rang sharply through the chamber as sparks flashed across the polished floor. Twice Aragorn thought he had found an opening, only to discover it had been deliberately offered to draw him into a dangerous position. The contest carried them around the glowing pedestal, while the mountain continued to tremble beneath their feet. Halbarad and the others held back, engaged by the remaining guards who had followed their master into the chamber. Aragorn now stood alone against the Ash Warden. His breathing grew heavier as the long pursuit across Eriador weighed upon his body. The captain noticed every sign of fatigue. "You have courage," he said between measured blows, "but courage alone cannot carry a weary arm forever." For a single heartbeat, Aragorn remembered another lesson learned many years before in Rivendell. During training, Elrond had often reminded him that the strongest opponent eventually trusted too completely in his own skill. Strength invited certainty. Certainty invited the smallest hesitation. Aragorn allowed himself one backward step, lowering his sword just enough to suggest exhaustion. The Ash Warden immediately advanced, committing fully to a powerful downward strike intended to end the duel. At the final instant, Aragorn shifted aside instead of meeting the blow directly. The captain's blade struck not Aragorn, but the edge of the white pedestal. A crack echoed through the chamber. The ancient stone, already strained by the awakening mechanisms beneath the mountain, split from top to bottom. Brilliant silver light burst through the widening fracture, flooding the tower with blinding radiance. The Master Stone did not explode in violence. Instead, it broke apart with a deep, resonant sound, like the tolling of a great bell heard across impossible distances. The glowing channels spreading through the floor dimmed one by one until only ordinary stone remained beneath their feet. The Ash Warden stared in stunned disbelief. Years of searching had ended, not in triumph, but in irreversible ruin. Before he could recover, another violent tremor shook the tower. Massive blocks broke free from the ceiling, crashing onto the polished floor as the ancient mechanisms failed completely. Elladan shouted for everyone to retreat. Aragorn turned toward the captain one final time. For the briefest moment, he considered offering his enemy escape. Then the Ash Warden looked back toward the shattered Master Stone rather than the open doorway, unwilling to abandon the object that had consumed his life. Without another word, he disappeared beneath a collapsing arch as stone and dust swallowed the center of the chamber. The survivors fled through the tower while the mountain came apart around them. Bridges cracked beneath their feet, underground streams burst through ancient walls, and centuries-old passages vanished in clouds of dust. More than once, Aragorn believed they would never reach the surface, yet Eladan and Elrohir guided them unerringly through collapsing corridors until at last, pale daylight appeared ahead. They emerged from the hidden entrance only moments before the hillside thundered inward, sealing the deepest vaults of Black Hollow, forever beneath thousands of tons of rock. The surviving orcs scattered into the wilderness without leadership, pursued by rangers and elves until none remained to threaten the north. As dawn spread across the eastern hills, Aragorn stood upon a ridge overlooking the ruined fortress. Black Hollow had become nothing more than another broken hill among many, its greatest secret hidden beyond the reach of those who would misuse it. Halbarad approached quietly, his arm bound where an orc blade had cut him during the final battle. "No songs will tell this tale," he said. Aragorn looked across the peaceful valleys stretching west toward Bree and the Shire, where ordinary folk were beginning another day without any knowledge of the danger that had passed them by. He rested one hand upon the small carved wooden bird still safely tucked inside his cloak and allowed himself a faint, weary smile. Steel was not forged by comfort or by victory alone. It was shaped in fire, tempered by hardship, and proven through faithful duty, carried out when no one would ever know the price. When you walk through Tolkien's Middle-earth, you soon discover that its greatest victories are seldom won upon famous battlefields. More often they are secured in forgotten valleys, beneath ruined towers, or along lonely roads where no king is present to witness what has been done. Aragorn's struggle in these hidden lands reminds you that evil rarely arrives with banners flying. It advances quietly, gathering scraps of forgotten knowledge, tempting the proud and persuading ordinary people that small betrayals carry little cost. Against such darkness, the greatest defense is not brilliance or strength alone, but steadfastness that refuses to bend, even when no reward can be expected. That quiet endurance is the unseen foundation upon which all the brighter tales of Middle-earth are built. The Ash Warden believed that wisdom could be separated from virtue, that the treasures of the ancient kingdoms could be possessed without accepting the duty that had once governed them. In Tolkien's world, that belief is always the first step toward ruin. Power is never condemned because it is powerful. It becomes dangerous when it is sought for mastery rather than service. Aragorn understands this long before he wears a crown. He is willing to destroy what his own people once created, because preserving hope for others matters more than preserving glory for himself. Such choices do not diminish the greatness of the past. They prove that its true heirs have learned the lesson their ancestors once lived by. You may also notice that the fate of the North rested not only in the hands of rangers and elves, but in the lives of shepherds, children, travelers and nameless folk whose stories are rarely written in the great chronicles. This too belongs deeply to Tolkien's vision. The mighty exist to guard the humble, not to stand above them, and the measure of a hero is found less in the enemies he defeats than in the ordinary lives that continue peacefully because of his sacrifice. The carved wooden bird, carried through every hardship, became as meaningful as any ancient relic, for it represented the simple world worth defending. In the end, kingdoms endure only if such small gifts still matter. Hope in Middle-earth is never loud. It does not erase sorrow, restore every ruin, or promise that darkness will never return. Instead, it survives because each generation chooses once again to stand watch where others might have turned away. Aragorn leaves Black Hollow with no song sung in his honor, yet every unseen mile he walks brings him closer to becoming the king his people will one day need. Steel is forged not in a single blaze, but through repeated trials, each fire strengthening what came before until the blade can bear any burden placed upon it. That is why his hidden years matter as much as his victories in the days that follow. And so, when your thoughts return to the beginning of this tale, you may remember the lonely hills of Eriador beneath the fading light of autumn. The wind still bends the tall grass, the old stones still keep their silent watch, and the roads remain empty to those who do not know who walks them after sunset. Somewhere beyond the last farm and the last warm hearth, a lone ranger once more climbs a quiet ridge and lets his gaze wander across the gathering dusk. The people below see only another peaceful evening, unaware that peace has guardians they will never meet, and that is exactly as it should be.